what's up, everybody? My name is Jeremy Schumacher. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for stopping by and checking out the channel today. I talked about it on social media. We're going to talk about the Vince McMahon documentary on Netflix, Mr. McMahon. Heavy sigh because the documentary was disappointing. If you don't know anything about pro wrestling and are coming in kind of new to it, I think the documentary does a really good job of introducing the sordid past of Mr. McMahon and highlights that he's not a good guy. I think that the fact that the documentary was on Netflix, was produced by Bill Simmons, who's who's buddies with Nick Khan, who's the current CEO of WWE, is deeply problematic. Netflix just bought the rights to WWE's streaming. At least Raw, I think SmackDown is on. I don't watch WWE that much anymore. I'm a big wrestling fan. I have on a pro wrestling shirt. You can't see it. You can't see it. It doesn't matter. It says "Worship the Old Gods." It's a House of Black reference, and it looks super pagan-y and like a metal shirt. I watch AEW, All Elite Wrestling, and New Japan Pro Wrestling. So I'm a wrestling fan to the extent that I'm a wrestling hipster, and I watch the good stuff. But I'm familiar with WWE. I could tell you what the current storylines are. I could tell you why they suck and why I don't watch WWE anymore. I'm not like a WWE hater. I think pro wrestling doing well as an industry is good for the wrestlers that I like and I follow. So I'm not a homer about it. I just Lucha Underground is the best pro wrestling that's ever existed. I'm skeptical it'll ever get topped. It's still my favorite. So that's where I'm at in my fandom. But I'm a big pro wrestling fan, so I know a lot about Vince McMahon. I knew a lot about this documentary heading in. This documentary to wrestling fans was promoted as a burial of Vince McMahon, ending the myth that he's a good businessman and highlighting that he's just an awful person, which for all of us wrestling fans is yep, we know. I mentioned this on social media. The Behind the Bastards podcast, which is great, did a 6-part episode on it. I think it's tied for the most episodes they've done on anyone, is how problematic Vince McMahon is. Him and Henry Kissinger have gotten 6 episodes each. So I have a script today, which is not a thing I usually do because I have a lot of thoughts on this topic and I know a lot about pro wrestling. So yeah, I think the fact that Netflix was airing it and it was made by a friend of the current regime at WWE was always going to be a puff piece on one bad apple, but how could any of the other people know? They all knew. Hulk Hogan, who's interviewed in this, is an awful person. Steve Austin, who I can still say I've enjoyed his wrestling throughout his career, but domestic violence, alcohol abuse, that's his character based on his real life persona. As far as I know, The Undertaker's not that problematic, but a big Vince guy, who they got to interview, the wrestlers they interviewed are all people who were Vince McMahon was a father figure to me. Even Hulk Hogan, who had issues with Vince, public issues with Vince, is a Vince guy to the end. So what I would say, if you don't want to stick with all the wrestling nerdy stuff I'm going to dive into, is it was a disappointing Netflix promo in that it kind of cast Mr. McMahon as a problematic figure, but question mark, question mark, question mark. It didn't nail him as this dude should be behind bars. And it definitely didn't do a good job of highlighting this industry needs change, which John Oliver accomplished in 20 minutes in a piece about WWE a couple of years ago. So yeah, it was a swing and a miss, and it was Netflix's way, I think, ultimately, cynically, of being able to say, we're about to put this on our network. Please watch it. Pro wrestling, huzzah. If you thought wrestling used to be bad because of steroids and other things you may have heard about, that was all just this one guy. Now, please tune in. So yeah, it sucked. It sucked from the perspective that it had a chance and they had access to the people to make it a really in-depth deep dive and take the industry to task, and they just didn't do that. And ultimately, it was a puff piece. It was a puff piece for the current regime, and that sucks, which we'll get into based on the script. It's not a script. It's 3 talking points per episode. That will take me 10 minutes each to talk about. So Let's see if we can do a longer video than me complaining about Harrison Butker. Um, Episode one is sort of Vince's breaking into the industry. Um, there's like some nostalgia. There's some oversimplification of this process. Back in the day, wrestling was different territories with different promoters who promoted in that territory, and guys kind of stuck with that. That was the Carney model, traveling circuses sort of approach of it. And not a lot of people broke that. There were some people who sort of transcended that, like Ric Flair. Um, but like for the most part, you came from a territory, and then like that's what it was. And so Vince is kind of like Walmart is the example I use for non-wrestling people. Like Walmart coming in and like taking over all the mom and pop stuff. Like Vince is Walmart. He's a bad guy. He's the distillation of capitalism into its shittiest form, in where he gets all the money, no one else does, and he's profiting off of other people's labor. I'm not suggesting that Vince McMahon doesn't do any work. He's a workaholic. We'll get into that. It's probably trauma based. But like, yeah, like he wrestles on and off. He famously tore both his quads in one instance in a pretty infamous segment on Raw. So like I'm not saying he doesn't put his body on the line, but like he doesn't care about wrestler safety. He's anti-union. He's just a problematic figure as a businessman. Like, there's no way he shouldn't be offering these people medical and paying for their retirements and doing all these things. Like Diamond Dallas Page, DDP has done more to save pro wrestlers from killing themselves, killing other people, and the effects of CTE than WWE has ever done. Just because DDP sells yoga to wrestlers and like lets them move in with him and rehab and stuff. Like, this wouldn't be hard for a billion-dollar industry to do. They just don't want the bad press, and they aren't held to any standard for it. It's dumb. This is dumb. Pro wrestling is awesome when it is done well, and like the industry itself is very deregulated on purpose. Like again, Linda McMahon was in Donald Trump's cabinet as the small business secretary, and she's never owned a small business in her life. So, WTF? But there's a lot of. We'll get to Trump. It's in the list. So yeah, Vince kind of breaks this like status quo, and like that's how he gets wealthy. And the retelling, like you can tell this is a WWE production. It's a puff piece because of how friendly they are to like, oh, no one knew if this WrestleMania thing would work. Like, yes, they did, or they wouldn't have done it. Like, they knew it would work. It was new and different, but if it would have crashed and burned, it's not like WWF would have stopped existing. WWF at the time. So like just that like true propaganda of this retelling, especially when you just have someone like Hulk Hogan and loosely the Undertaker talking about that time, like come on. With all the resources Netflix has, like they could have done a lot better job with this. And like so, at one point I think Eric Bischoff or somebody who worked for a different promotion said like the older generation of promoters referred to Vince as Satan. Like that's how bad of a guy he was. And I think if you think about like how bad Walmart and then, subsequently Amazon has been for like mom and pop, your local, like community owned, community run store that doesn't exist anymore. And most of us have never experienced existing at all because like Walmart came in and took all that stuff away. So yeah, it's just like capitalism in its shittiest form. Vince gave a interview to Playboy many years ago, talking about his past and his childhood, where it's very bizarre. And again, because I know a lot about wrestling, I've read biographies. Like I go to Barnes and Noble and read wrestling biographies. I'm that person. For like, who's watching pro wrestling? It's me. I have multiple graduate level degrees, and pro wrestling's awesome. And it's one of those things where Vince's story changes a lot. So like the documentary sort of is like, is this his character or is this the real person? And like definitively, like he's just his character. Like he is the person he is. Pro wrestling is all about just turning your character up a little bit when you're on screen. Stone Cold Steve Austin is this, toughest SOB in Texas, like just kind of ass kicker. Like he owns a ranch. He's a big softie. He like loves his cats, but like at the time he got into bar fights and he beat his wife. And like, I'm not promoting that or saying that's a good thing, but like, yeah, he was a hellraiser. Like that's his character on screen turned up to 11. And so like there's this toxic masculinity thing. But in the Playboy interview, Vince talks about being abused, definitely by his stepfather. He seems to hint he was sexually abused by his mom. He was definitely sexually abused by like some neighborhood kids, but he's talking to Playboy, so he like makes it sound awesome that like older kids were molesting him because that was cool, question mark. And it's very bizarre and it's uncomfortable, right? Like that's not great. He's a victim of sexual abuse. Um, but it's like how he doesn't react to it appropriately or accurately. And again, like I'm not throwing shade at the victim here. I'm just saying like you can tell he hasn't done any work. A lot of his life makes sense in this lens that he's been running from that and trying to twist it into like this good thing. Like I'm just this hypersexual dude who's like so sexually prolific that even in my childhood people wanted to touch me. And like that's not how that works, but that's how he sort of like tells this story and it's gross and it's disturbing. And so then like when it comes out that he's been sexually assaulting people for years and has been keeping other abusers close to him for years, like it makes more sense where like, yeah, that victim mentality and never doing the work, never like recovering from that trauma and growing and healing at all, like means he's both a victim and a perpetrator. And we see that a lot. So it's one of those things where like the Playboy interview and some of his older stuff doesn't mesh with what he talks about in this one. There are hints to it, but like without having any of that extra context, again, Netflix doesn't dig in there, and there's no pushback. I have read because I spend time with pro wrestling that behind the scenes this documentary was heavily edited. That Vince just isn't with it all that much mentally. A lot of questions need to be repeated. He lost track of what he was talking about a lot. There were people off screen giving him like reminders and cues. So, you know, I have some space for like his memory isn't what it used to be and he's not actively lying, but like there's enough of other stuff in the documentary that I know he's actively lying about to say, like, again, this is a disingenuous puff piece of a documentary to say, like, we can't tell when like you can absolutely tell. You can absolutely tell that Vince is an awful person and his character is an awful person. And he plays the awful person really well because that's who he is in real life. He's turning it up for being on screen, but that's who he is. Hogan says that, Cena says that, Undertaker, Austin, everybody says he's the same person except for Vince. And the documentary goes, oh, well, how will we be able to tell? Like, he's a bad person. So is Hunter. So is Hulk. Like, these are not good people. We know that. Why are we pretending that they're not? Oh, because Netflix now has the stock in WWE doing well. Vince, this isn't in the documentary, but like it's also how we know Vince is a liar. Is like he talks about being in like a street gang and getting in fights a lot, and like anyone who grew up with Vince disputes that. So once he meets his dad, so like his dad and his mom split. He's not with his dad. Vince McMahon Senior, the wrestling promoter, he doesn't meet him until he's like 12, and then he like falls sort of in love with wrestling. But he's sort of taken in by Gorgeous George, and like Gorgeous George is like a heel. He's a bad guy wrestler. He's very flamboyant. He drives fast convertible cars, and he dresses in bright flamboyant colors, and like he's kind of like coded as like a queer character, but like that was hated back then. And so he's like the bad guy. He gets heat. The crowd boos him, but he's a big tough guy. So he'll beat you up even though you're booing him. And he doesn't care what you think, which would be like kind of radical and cool if it wasn't in any other industry other than pro wrestling. But in real life, Gorgeous George is making a lot of money, sort of like smoking big fancy cigars, running red lights in his car convertible, which like is dangerous. But like Vince is fascinated by this character. And again, so like you start to see that this really impressionable kid who's coming out of a lot of trauma is around these larger than life characters who are not good role models. And we also have reason to believe that like abuse was pretty rampant in wrestling back then too. Again, it's just not a well regulated industry, and there's a lot of talk about like sexual assaults as like pranks or ribs would be the wrestling term. They're just ribbing a guy. And like it's deeply disturbing and gross, and also like everyone sort of hand waves it as like, oh, it was the 80s. So my guess is that Vince was just in this culture where abuse was really normalized as well. Again, not defending it, but saying he's coming out of this culture where being molested didn't make him feel powerful, and then he sees these people who are sort of like being booed, being hated, and like middle finger to it all anyway. And he loves that idea of like, I don't have to care what people think. Along with that, Vince is deeply, deeply needy for his father's affection and approval, which Vince Sr. just does not give him. And again, Vince like breaks all these social norms in the wrestling industry, which maybe have not been great to begin with, but like he does a lot of bad stuff to get where he's at and pretty much ignores his dad after he buys the business from his dad. And like again, his dad didn't hand it to him. He had to like sort of work for it. And so like there's all this competitive compensatory stuff and it's shitty and like it's very toxic masculinity. And like Vince kind of embodies what I think toxic masculinity could be summed up as, even in then how he finally like treats his own kids. So that's sort of episode one. And again, I think it's like misses some of the pieces. It doesn't even tell as like coherent of a story as I just told. It fills in a lot of the details on like how the promotion of regional wrestling worked. But like it doesn't get much into like Vince's very traumatic childhood and also like how his story has changed a lot over the years, depending on who he's talking to and why. So, episode two gets into some of the scandals of Vince. Vince is accused of sexually assaulting a ref, which he almost certainly did. It's why Andre the Giant hated Vince. He was very protective of the female refs, and he and Vince really had a falling out later in life. Vince was very not good to Andre the Giant anyway. Unless you only look at it from a capitalistic sense. Like the only thing that makes sense for Vince is like looking at it as like, but he made a lot of money. And so in the wrestling industry in which there is no safety net, there isn't insurance, there isn't, paid time off and other stuff, like making money, doing business, as they call it, doing business, like if you're leaving money on the table, you're doing pro wrestling wrong. And so like it's just that carny vibe. And like the only defense of any of Vince's behaviors are like, but it worked because he made a lot of money. And like as a mental health professional, I can't help but be like, what cost is okay for all this trauma? Like how much money do we need to ruin people's lives? How many people need to die by suicide or be murdered or drug overdosed for this to be okay? And like apparently Netflix has the dollar amount in mind. Apparently, TKO Sports and Dwayne Johnson are cool with it, but like I'm not. Part of the reason I don't watch WWE is because like Vince is gross. And even though he's not in the company anymore, like when TKO bought it, they absolutely knew about his sexual assault allegations. This one's from the 80s. And yeah, the ones that are newer and more recent are worse because we have his text messages, which are disturbing. I don't recommend looking them up. But like, this is a known thing. Like, this guy was an abuser. Jimmy Superfly Snuka, this is in the documentary, killed his girlfriend in a hotel. Allegedly, I think I probably need to say just to cover some bases. But like, Vince covered that up again, pretty well known, and like kept Snuka on TV for a long time. Vince is like, again, I hold some space for like trauma abuse, like sexual assault victim here. I don't want to like demonize his stuff, but Vince is like, again, toxic masculinity. He's so like homophobic while being deeply, deeply interested in the male body and how many muscles a single male can have. So again, like I'm not saying he's like a closeted homosexual. I am saying like the homophobia seems performative. Vince was all in on steroids. Vince opened his own bodybuilding industry. Let's see, what was it called? The World Bodybuilding Federation. So it was World Wrestling Federation at the time, and then World Bodybuilding Federation shortly before steroids became illegal. So really bad timing on this, and the documentary glosses over this. It's like, oh, whoopsie. But this was a terrible idea that was based on bodybuilding before wrestling started regulating steroid use and saying it's illegal. So Vince opened his own industry saying steroid use isn't illegal here. Do all the steroids. Let's see what the human body can do. In again, sort of a weird, obsessive way. And historically, like Vince has been just a big fan of body guys. Like John Cena was not a good wrestler, but he was a good bodybuilder. Dave Batista did not start out as a good wrestler, although he got a lot better. But was a body guy. Like Vince didn't like a good wrestler like Bryan Danielson. Never brought in the Young Bucks, like some of the other stuff. He doesn't like the small people. Even a current example of like Ricochet not really doing much in WWE. He doesn't like the small guys, even if they're like just muscle upon muscle. Like Pac is this small, angry British man who flies through the air and is just muscles. And again, like didn't do anything in WWE. He's had an awesome match against Austin Aries on a pre-show of WrestleMania. They packaged him as like Mighty Mouse and like made him a joke. So Vince has always just been like a big fan of like big muscly dudes, and so like bringing in Hulk Hogan, it's like a bodybuilder. Hulk was not a good wrestler. Some of his work in the '80s was good in Japan. I know that sounds so hipstery of me. What a pretentious wrestling fan I am. Vince Hogan did some cool stuff in Japan where like he actually wrestled a bit, and like Young Andre the Giant too. Like I mean, there's some cool stuff that these guys were doing. Like just watching like WWF doesn't do it justice. Like old New Japan, AWA or not AWA, All Japan stuff. Like a lot of that stuff is really great. Japanese wrestling was awesome, especially through the '90s. Like the Japanese wrestling that was happening in the '90s is where some of the people from America went to do good work, and then influenced the boom of the early 2000 indies, which has given us modern wrestling, ROH, and a lot of that stuff. CM Punk, Samoa Joe, Bryan Danielson, Homicide, Nigel McGuinness, like all those dudes in early the 2000s were influenced by the Japanese wrestling scene. So like, anyway, I'm off topic here. Let's see, Hogan's terrible. So anyway, Vince opens like this. He knew steroids were bad. He knew regulation was coming. So he opened his own steroid thing to be like, no regulation. And again, he knew they were bad and didn't care because he wanted to see how many muscles people could get. And like, there it is. That's indicative of who Vince McMahon is. You want to know who Mr. McMahon is? He's somebody who doesn't care about other humans as long as he's happy. And so, yeah, that's not good. So the Bodybuilding Federation obviously fails. Nobody wants to pay for it. We're learning roid rage is the thing, and steroids are bad for you, and they eat your brain, and you know they give you big muscles, but at what cost? And like not a worthwhile one, except Vince McMahon, who also kept using steroids and has worked really hard to make sure that his wrestlers can keep using steroids. Gasp, gasp! We should. Looking at you, 2001 Hunter Hearst Helmsley coming back for the Royal Rumble when you're just ridiculously jacked and then you get busted for doing steroids and then you get all flabby. Like again, like the evidence that people kept using steroids and have continued to work around the WWE's regulations because there aren't good regulations because they're not regulated as a sport because Vince McMahon has fought in court to keep them from being regulated because he wants people to keep doing steroids. Hogan goes on TV, chokes out a talk show host. He falls, hits his head. Like it's very problematic. Hulk Hogan's always been a problematic dude. Not even the documentary obviously doesn't get into Hogan's racism, in which he's been filmed saying the N-word multiple times. He's not a good person. To be putting him in a documentary in 2022, 23, and into 24 is reprehensible on Netflix's part. Like the fact that Netflix has gotten no blowback from this again is indicative that like pro wrestling is just sort of treated with like weirdo kid gloves. Is like, oh, that's weird, so we're not going to treat it like a regular thing, even though it's just a regular thing. It's a business. It's a sport. It gets into like probably like the abuse and stuff that happens in like theater and opera and stage. Like, you know, maybe we should stop abusing kids and other humans. Can't talk about pro wrestling if that's our stance, though. So yeah, episode 2 kind of gets into like some of these controversies. What I didn't like about episode 2 is it's told out of order, and so it's sort of told in a way that makes it sound like all of these controversies are coming to head in the mid 90s, and then like, woo, the Attitude Era solves all that. And like, A, that's not how that works, and B, that's not chronologically what happened. So yeah, they kind of simplified it for storytelling purposes, but like that also makes Vince look like a good guy. Like he went to court and got off, so guess nothing bad happened. But like The fact that a rich guy got off in court doesn't necessarily mean that like he didn't do anything wrong and that he didn't break any crimes. He's clearly an awful person. He did illegal stuff. The fact that he wasn't found guilty isn't super shocking. Also, like just the tackiness of showing up in a neck brace to try and get sympathy from the jury. And again, like there's a way to do this in pro wrestling that's funny because in AEW, all right, like wrestling WWE homeboys be mad at me for being an AEW fan. But like Tony Khan, who's the son of the Jaguars owner, took a wrestling move from the Young Bucks, the TK driver. They've renamed it. It used to be the Meltzer driver. It was the Indie Taker before that. You know, whatever. It's a ridiculous finishing move. Nick Jackson flips off the top turnbuckle, lands. His brother is holding somebody in tombstone position, which is the Undertaker's finisher. They tombstone pile drive them together. And Tony Khan then had the NFL draft like 2 days later, and so he wore a neck brace to it. And like that's very funny, and it got a bunch of publicity for AEW that Tony Khan wore a neck brace. And like looking around at the draft, full range of motion, wearing a neck brace, very comically like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Get it? This is an act, which in 2024 you can absolutely do with pro wrestling. We all know it's fake. It's fine. So like that's the other weird thing, and it gets into it a little bit with like episode 3, talking about kayfabe and like protecting that like this is an act. Really big deal through the 80s and even the early 90s. I would say up until the Clique saying goodbye to each other, which was Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Triple H, and Shawn Michaels, too sweeting each other. That Hosier song, as a wrestling fan, is really hard for me to listen to because he sings too sweet all the time, and I just looking to too sweet people. If you're a wrestling fan, you know what I'm talking about. But like Bret Hart signaling WCW during the Montreal Screwjob and stuff, like kayfabe's killed in the 90s for sure. But really, even like some of that side into Vince and the steroid use and some of that stuff, as like this stuff was fake, and like people were figuring out in the 90s. The dirt sheets they're called, like wrestling reporters. They used to be actual like magazines and journalists. There were early online communities talking about pro wrestling. The dirt sheets that cover it all knew we're in on like this is fake. This is a worked production. So they call things shoots and works. Shoots is like a real life thing. And then there's a work shoot, and then there's all these different wrestling terms that kind of like again insulate the industry from being treated like any other industry. But so one of my big issues with episode 3 is sort of like it gets into all these issues coming to a head: the Snuka murder, the sexual assault of the ref, Hogan choking out people on TV, Vince assaulted reporter on TV. There was the other wrestler who smacked a guy. I like steroids are a problem. Vince covered up a murder, sexual assault. Some of the Ring Boy scandals coming out here where like Pat Patterson and some other people were assaulting teenage boys who were volunteering or getting paid to work on the ring crew. And like, that's problematic. And again, like it's the late 80s into the 90s. So like people are acting weird about Pat Patterson being gay instead of being like, hey, maybe we should stop the child abuse. That's not because he's gay. It's because there are abusers in this industry. And Vince kept Pat Patterson around anyway. Like he's fired for a little bit and then Vince brings it back. And like he's just with WWE for a long time now. So, but this never ending alibi in wrestling of like, you do what's best for business. Eric Bischoff, who was working for WCW, WWE's big rival in the 90s, his autobiography is controversy creates cash. Like you get Dennis Rodman in, you get known pedophile Karl Malone in. The NBA has problems too. Like you get these big names in, and that like gets people looking. And so in the 90s, there's this big look for like TV ratings, and wrestling's very popular. That's the peak of the pro wrestling industry. That's when I'm exposed to pro wrestling in my life, like the height of the Attitude Era. Rock and Austin, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. First time I ever watched pro wrestling is where The Rock throws Stone Cold off of a bridge. And like, I didn't know pro wrestling. I didn't know that like it was fake. I didn't like, why are they on a bridge? I was unaware. They were fighting over the title. So like wrestling just gives you enough of a reason to be like, it's a competition. And like, there you go. Then like we can throw people off bridges and stuff. And like, I was fascinated by this, right? Like, did I just watch a live murder on TV? And like, you don't spend much time with it before you realize it's fake. But like, that's when DX was taking off. Like, if you were, a millennial and people in fourth, fifth, sixth grade weren't telling each other to suck it and crotch chopping and like doing all the pro wrestling stuff, like, I don't know where you grew up. I went to a very conservative religious school, and like we knew what DX was, and we're playing pro wrestling games on the Nintendo 64. Like, and I didn't have cable. I didn't know any of this stuff. It was like because of how much other kids talked about it and like watched it and stuff. So yeah, but this idea that like do what's best for business as long as it's making money, it's justifiable. And like I get that that's true for capitalism writ large, like the pollution, the land destruction, taking people away from their indigenous lands, like in the name of capitalism, like the ends justify the means. That's shitty and also like true. Like crime as a social construct that one person who litters can go to jail, but a corporation that destroys an entire ecosystem is not held accountable is preposterous. But that's kind of the idea here. So like it's all about the Montreal screw job and like the ratings war, like WWE. I'm getting ahead. It's about WCW and the ratings war. And so Scott Hall and Kevin Nash are leaving for WCW. Too sweet, Madison Square Garden, and it's like big scandal, whatever. Triple H gets buried, and like leading into the screw job, and like Triple H isn't dating Stephanie yet, but like he's involved on the business side of things. Shawn Michaels and Vince are very close. Shawn Michaels is like an addict at this point, and like so he's hard to work with, but like he's one of the most gifted wrestlers. Of I'm not going to put him in Mount Rushmore. Again, offensive to wrestling fans, but he's very good. He's the big draw. Stone Cold's on his way up. Bret Hart is still at the top of his game. So like, but all these people are leaving. Hogan, Hall, and Nash all leave. They form the NWO and WCW, which arguably is probably the most successful wrestling storyline of all time. And in like classic shitty wrestling fashion, it doesn't have a satisfying conclusion. But like the Four Horsemen, like there are factions in pro wrestling, and so Ric Flair had the Four Horsemen, and there are these factions. So like it's kind of these guys who are good on their own right teaming up to just run roughshod over everyone because no one else can like counter them. So NWO gets really popular. New World Order, Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash. It's cool. They're cool. They're like very anti-authority, anti-establishment, whatever. WCW is live, which is new for television at the time, where WWF, I think it's still WWF at that point. It didn't rebrand to WWE until the early 2000s. Is pre-recorded, so WCW would read like the results on it, so you didn't need to watch it. And like there is some fascinating stuff out of that time. I still think wrestling's deeply problematic. The way women are treated, the way minorities are treated. There's no unions. Again, like Hulk Hogan union busted. I think I talked about it in the Hulk Hogan vid I did when he was at the RNC. So Hogan's also a piece of trash. Go watch that video if you were unaware that Hulk Hogan is a garbage person. And so, yeah, like, again, the documentary sort of glosses over the current regime. Shawn Michaels, HBK, the Heartbreak Kid, is running NXT for WWE right now. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Triple H, is married to Stephanie McMahon, is one of the COOs for WWE right now, is pretty much the head of creative. He's doing all the current storylines and one of the big like writers. I don't think he's credited as a writer, but so they're like deeply enmeshed in all of this stuff. They're super tight with Vince, and like to preposterously claim that in 2024 they didn't know what's going on in Vince's life is like, no way. No way. If Tony Atlas knows about all this stuff, there's no way that Triple H and Shawn Michaels didn't know about this stuff. Triple H was sworn to secrecy for the Montreal screw job and like took that for 25 years before he came out that like, yeah, I knew about it. There's no way he didn't know that they were sex trafficking people and abusing people, and Vince is a garbage person who was treating women poorly. Like, Stephanie got a boob job, and again, not throwing shame, not like, but then is like got like her characters on TV getting slut shamed regularly because that's what she did in the late 90s and early 2000s. Question mark, question mark, question mark. But again, like modify your body and then we're going to make fun of you for it is like a ridiculous thing. Vince treats women on screen very poorly. 35 minutes here. I guess I should speed up. Anyway, so WCW's on the rise. NWO is very cool. The Bullet Club is like the most recent iteration of that sort of four horsemen NWO idea. Bullet Club's cool too. Basically, it's for life. A lot of the stuff doesn't end well, but a lot of the big players in pro wrestling right now went through Japan and were part of the Bullet Club. So Finn Balor, AJ Styles, the Young Bucks, Kenny Omega, Cody Rhodes, like all those people are Bullet Club people from New Japan. So like NWO, and I would say like the NWO is a modern retelling of the Four Horsemen idea. Like it wasn't a new concept. It was just very cool. It hit at the right time to be very popular. So yeah, we had the screw job, all that stuff going on. My takeaway from episode 3 was like, if you're trying to tell me that Shawn Michaels and Triple H didn't know how Vince was abusing women, I say no way. There's zero way that is possible. And so like Netflix again isn't going to tell that story because Triple H is still around. So is Shawn Michaels. Like these people are still deeply entrenched in WWE. So if they want to tell the story that like we've cleaned up our act and please watch our show, that's how you do it. If you want to tell the actual story, Triple H has been buddies with Vince for a long time and knows all his deep dark secrets. You can't tell me he doesn't know this stuff. Episode 4 is the rise of the Attitude Era. So WWE finally takes over the ratings. And Mankind, Dude Love, Cactus Jack, Mrs. Foley's baby boy, is nowhere to be found. And how you tell a story about the Attitude Era without Mankind is... I struggle to find words to encapsulate how ridiculous that is. It's ridiculous that Pete Rose is not in the Baseball Hall of Fame when he's the category leader in multiple statistics. And that pales in comparison to how you tell a story about the Attitude Era without Mankind. The episode of Raw where they take the lead back from WCW and never look back is because WCW was still reading the results on WCW Live, and they said, Mankind wins the championship tonight on Raw, and everyone, I'm being hyperbolic here, a lot of people clicked off WCW to watch Mankind win the championship because it was a very satisfying conclusion to his storyline. Mick Foley's this chubby little weirdo who loses his mind. He was Cactus Jack in ECW, this like wanted outlaw wrestling figure who like, whatever, is an outlaw and like did crazy things and jumped through flaming tables and landed on thumbtacks and had a barbed wire bat he carried around. Cactus Jack was awesome. He comes to WWE, he doesn't do that much. He loses his mind, literally goes insane, and he comes back as Mankind, a reflection of how humanity is twisted and evil and terrible. This poor man has been rejected. He wears a mask that's leather and has nails in it, and he's wearing a torn shirt, business shirt, and he pulls Mr. Sacco out of his pants and chokes people with it. Pro wrestling's really weird, and if you explain too much of it, it starts to sound worse and worse and worse. Mankind's awesome. He's this disturbed little weirdo, and we feel for him, and he finally wins the championship. That is the pivotal storyline that gets WWE to take the lead in the ratings from WCW. NWO had lost his team here. Eric Bischoff had no plan to end that story. He didn't know what he was doing. It got too big. It's very cool that Sting didn't talk for 2 years and would come down from the rafters with his bat. Doubly cool that Sting would come down sometimes with the rafters wearing a face mask of Sting and then take off the face mask and have his face paint on underneath it. That's always going to be cool. I don't care how many times I see it. That's a good bit. That's incredible. This guy pretending to not be the guy he is by wearing the mask that makes him look like the guy that he is. Incredible. Best disguise ever. He did it multiple times throughout his career. It never stops being awesome. But yeah, as a wrestling fan, like this is preposterous that Mankind isn't it. I think Mankind would say, because Mankind seems to be like a genuinely decent human being, Like, yeah, Vince is problematic. I don't think we should put him on a pedestal. So I'm sure that's why he wasn't interviewed. Um, at one point, Triple H says at the end of the episode, "Who's worse, the guy who did it or the people who cheered?" He's talking about how Vince is playing this character, Vince McMahon, and acting offended now that people were cheering for women in bra and panties match, that Vince made people bark like a dog, that he had a whole string of people kissing his ass publicly on television as a way to humiliate them, and to suggest that like that's the audience's fault is preposterous. Who's to blame is the person with the power, the person who's writing the show, the person who owns all the cameras that are broadcasting the show to cable television, the person who's making their independent contractors do this or potentially lose their jobs, the guy who made people give him sexual favors so that they could keep their jobs. That's the guy to blame. A rhetorical question around, is the guy to blame, the guy who has all the power making all the decisions, or the people who are cheering for him, the guy who has all the power? 100% is to blame every time. There is a larger conversation, perhaps, to have significantly later after we establish that guy's to blame about what does it mean for an audience that's cheering for these things. Sure, we can talk about that, but they're not holding any of the power, right? Like, again, the idea that not only did Triple H say that lets me know for sure he knows about all the abuse and more of it that we don't even know about yet, but also that like he has no frame of reference for how terrible this stuff is. And Netflix too. Again, the idea of this documentary went out and people are like, "Oh, Vince was kind of a bad guy, huh?" And Netflix is getting none of the blowback is insane to me. They knew about the abuse. TKO Sports knows about the abuse. Again, TKO Sports owns UFC as well. Dana White punched his wife on live television and is somehow just like neither in jail and like also not a pariah in the business world. What are we doing? I love pro wrestling. That's why I'm getting so animated. It would be great if we held people in power accountable for doing shitty things. Owen Hart falls to his death live on TV. They continue the show because, again, the wrestling industry is terrible. And Vince is like, you got to do what's best for business. The show must go on. The show, by the way, while Owen Hart's blood from falling from the rafters and dying in the ring is on the canvas, you can see the blood, involves one guy fighting with another guy for checking out his manager's cleavage, which for much of the 90s, breasts were referred to as puppies because I don't know, it's written by traumatized people whose brains then didn't develop and are emotionally immature. Just immature in general, I guess, across the board, stunted developmentally. And yeah, if you're like in my age range, seeing women who are bodybuilders and beautiful in bikinis is super appealing, right? Your core demographic is that 18 to 35 demographic. That's always been the core demographic for pro wrestling. Like, if you're going after that, you're saying sex sells. But again, like, this wasn't empowered women being put in places of power. This is people who didn't have contracts and no guaranteed money being told to do these things or potentially lose their job. That's always the threat behind everything with Vince is if you piss him off or you don't do what he wants, you're blacklisted, you're not going to get TV time, or you're out of the industry. That's abuse. That's abuse. It it's upsetting. It's upsetting. So, like again, this idea that the show must go on because we want to talk about puppies and have a wrestling match over who looked at whose puppies, like, and again, puppies meaning breasts here. Uh, no, someone just died, a beloved character that you were humiliating because you were mad that his brother went to the other company because Owen Hart famously is afraid of heights and you were having him play a joke superhero character to make him look like an idiot. One of the best in-ring technicians of all time from a prestigious wrestling family that you went out of your way to embarrass. The show doesn't need to go on. That's you being a shitty human and not knowing how to handle something going poorly because you're just worried that people will be mad at you because your daddy didn't love you enough And so now you're just living your life looking for adoration this whole time while being a shitty person, so wanting no accountability and all the adulation. That's the story of Mr. McMahon. Fuck Vince McMahon. Episode 5. We're not even we're 4 out of the 6 right now. Episode 5 is a weird retelling of the invasion angle in which Vince buys WCW. It's hurting for money. They're going to go out of business. Ted Turner doesn't want to keep doing pro wrestling. Um, and the story is that Shane buys it, right? And it's like, isn't what happens in real life. But Shane and Vince are revisiting Vince's trauma where his dad didn't give him the business. Shane's like, I gotta work, I gotta earn it. So like Shane ruins his body for years trying to be a pro wrestler when he's not a trained pro wrestler. So he's just like gets famous for taking these stupid, unnecessary risks in his matches. Definitely wrestled through a concussion with Kurt Angle at King of the Ring. Anyway, and so like in storyline, Shane buys WCW and it's going to take over from his dad. Again, a really cool concept. And if people didn't really follow pro wrestling, they probably remember this being like awesome. The invasion angle was awesome. It wasn't. It was a good concept that was executed very poorly, and again, never had a payoff. There was no end. It just didn't end. It's nonsense. One of the things that's great about pro wrestling is there's no off season. One of the things that pro wrestling really hasn't figured out yet is like you have so many talented wrestlers on your roster, you could have different seasons and do different story. Like they do different storylines. They never really like have different seasons, and they could have different stuff going on, so they're not ruining the wrestlers' bodies so much. But like again, that's what this industry is about. It's not about health and wellness, entertaining people in a safe and sustainable way. It's about making as much money as possible at whatever expense, whatever cost to humans is necessary. It's absolutely again just like a retelling. It's WWE propaganda that like this era of wrestling was about Shane and Steph against Vince. Like those were some of the worst stories being told in this era. And generally, because WWE had no competition at this time, WCW folded, ROH existed and was awesome, but was very small time, like just for hardcore wrestling fans. Same with New Japan. New Japan is very popular in Japan. Like there wasn't any competition, and like WWE got super stagnant. Like this is the Super Cena era, John Cena who never lost. If you've gotten it this far, and in my video this far, you must like pro wrestling. If you haven't seen Wrestling Isn't Wrestling, the documentary, shoot, I forget who did the wrestling. It's really good. It's a retelling. It breaks down why wrestling's awesome, even though we all know it's all fake. It's like a love letter to pro wrestling, looking at just the character study of Triple H, Hunter Hearst Helmsley. And it's very well done. There's lots of fun wrestling references in it. Anyway, I don't know where I was. But this era of wrestling is very boring. Is when ROH really starts to take off because people were looking for an alternative. It's when like 8 years later, because WWE really didn't do anything for 8 years. Like at first, Edge versus Cena is cool, and I like Edge, but like, gosh, then it's just Cena and Randy Orton having really boring matches for a long time, and Cena never losing. It got really dark for a while there. Chris Benoit kills himself, kills his child and his wife. Vince doesn't care about concussions after that. The NFL also doesn't care about concussions. Like again, these giant organizations that are turning billions of dollars in profit are just not caring about the human cost. And anything that's going to impact their profit means they're not going to invest in it, like long-term care for people studying CTE. It's just like another example where like, yeah, Vince definitely knew this was bad and just didn't care, and like argues against it because it makes him look bad. And like it should. He should look bad. The Benoit thing should have been like a huge wake-up call. And it was again like we're gonna have a wellness policy, but no one enforces it except for us. So like guess how that goes. So anyway, like the Netflix documentary sort of retells it as like this is all about family drama. Like there's real family drama in the McMahons. Like Stephanie potentially underage slept with Macho Man Randy Savage, which is why Vince didn't put Macho Man in the Hall of Fame because he never forgave him for it. And like there's like stuff there that's like, holy crap, this is deeply problematic. Like And again, Netflix doesn't go anywhere near that stuff. Ah! And like I'm not happy about that, but like as a wrestling fan, like that's been rumored for forever. Why don't we like talk to some of the big players in that? Like, no, no, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna pretend that like Shane and Vince was a compelling storyline because it wasn't. Shane, out of everyone in this documentary, comes out looking the best. And I'm not sold on Shane being a good person, but like holding a lot of space for all the things Shane has done while having an awful human as a father does make Shane look a lot better. Uh, Vince also launches the XFL at this point. Again, like as concussions are becoming a problem, and like the science on it pretty emphatically says this is bad. Vince is like, haha, has anyone played NFL Blitz? Let's make that in real life. And also let's make the cheerleaders wear less clothes. Like again, he's just a horrible human. With really bad business sense. Again, sort of born with silver spoon. He wasn't. He grew up poor, his formative years, but then like he had an inside track to take over WWF. He used very poor business policy to like manipulate the industry to his own favor and kill it for everyone else. And then like just abuses that power over and over again. His other business choices have almost always been a failure. So like this is like the overlap between him and Trump is really interesting because Trump famously does not want to follow the rules, has made his money by taking shortcuts and like enriching himself and not other people. And all of his own business deals have been massive failures. He's still just cashing in on daddy's money. And like I do think Vince made more money than his dad ever did. And like Vince is regularly credited as making the wrestling business what it is today. And it wouldn't be this way. But like I argue that like it wouldn't be so toxic and abusive if he wasn't the person who had done that. Like he normalized that and he fought against the unions. He killed all the like the potential benefits for his workers, the wrestlers, fought against that stuff tooth and nail. So then like episode 6 sort of comes and it's just like, and then he retired and like there's some scandals. Oh, weird. We don't know about that though, because we started recording before it. And like, yes, you fucking did know about it. I knew about it as a casual wrestling fan. Not casual. I'm a pretty big fan. I knew about it as a regular wrestling fan. Every fan of wrestling knows about this stuff. The fact that it didn't come to public light before he started filming, okay. The idea that it was shocking wasn't. He retired, then he came back to sell the company, and then worse stuff came out. I don't think that's like happenstance. I'm not like super conspiratorial about it, other than like John Laurinaitis is named, Brock Lesnar is named. You can't tell me Triple H and HBK didn't know about what was going on. You can't tell me Steph, who's in the building all the time, didn't know what was going on. No way. I call bullshit. I call so much bullshit. Um, So yeah, like if you know anything about Vince McMahon, you watched the documentary, you already knew a lot of this stuff, that he's a garbage person. If anything, I think the documentary was too kind to him. They weren't kind, they were just like intentionally ambiguous. Like, oh, I don't know. It was sort of their stance. Um, like CM Punk isn't in it as at all, and I'll do a separate video on CM Punk being a garbage person. Um, but like Vince treated him very poorly, and like CM Punk's back in WWE because like best for business. Um, so I don't know. I think after Vince dies and he leaves it to his idiot daughter and doofus son-in-law, uh, that was just a joke for pro wrestling fans from Punk's famous pipe bomb promo. Um, I think other stuff will come out. I think people are still scared of Vince ultimately. And even though a lot of the shine has come off and, he publicly has been shamed for wanting to poop on people because he put that in a text message in 2023. I think people are still scared of him. I think people still don't want to speak out against the business. It's still very deregulated. There aren't any protections for the wrestlers. AEW is a lot better than WWE. Like they have full-time employees who get like full benefits and take care of healthcare stuff, but like not everyone is. But like neither is the NFL. Like they have a players union and like it's better than it would be without a union, but it's still not awesome. It just makes me sad. And like this idea that like people are making so much money off of it, but like the owners who really don't do much are making a ton off of it, and then taxpayers have to pay for new arenas all the time. Like our whole fascination with like the entertainment industry is like deeply problematic. All the stuff about Diddy coming out right now is like a known industry thing. Like all the stuff with, you know, any major abuser, Weinstein was known. People are just like dealing with it because of how much systemic abuse is in these industries. Because rich people hurt other people. To be that wealthy, you have to be an unethical person. And so, then our system is captured by wealthy people. There's lobbying and, you know, bribery is legal now. We just call it lobbying. And then the Supreme Court was like, nah, we're cool with bribery too. Because have you seen Clarence Thomas's RV? It's really cool. And this is why I like pro wrestling, because all of the real life shit's kind of depressing. And so being able to see a guy hit his boss with a steel chair is really cathartic sometimes. Seeing the underdog overcome all the obstacles thrown in his way and finally win the championship is really rewarding to be a part of. Uh, Being there with 20,000 people chanting yes at the little bearded weird guy winning the championship is really cool. Uh, and so wrestling is interesting in that it can bring you that joy and that community and that connection, and it can make you feel things as an escape from the reality that like these industries, the entertainment industry, a lot of our industries, really terrible. And I think we need that. I think we need sports. I think these things are good things. I would just love for them to be done with health and wellness in mind instead of profit in mind. And that's a big ask for the profit people. And that's what I got. That's what I got. I love pro wrestling. I think you should watch it. I think you should not watch WWE. Not because the product is inferior, although it is. Watch AEW. Watch New Japan. Support your local indie show. I'm going to a show coming up in November. Brawl at the Beer Hall. Lakefront Brewery, shout out to Milwaukee local brewery, is hosting a wrestling event in their beer hall. That's going to be awesome. I don't know if the wrestling will be any good or not. I don't even know who's on the card, but like that's a cool venue, and seeing pro wrestling live is really fun. I took my 6-year-old to see an AEW event recently, and as he learned that like he could boo at people, that he could chant "shut the fuck up" with someone, and I wouldn't scold him for it. He was all the way in. He booed someone for 10 straight minutes. I feel bad for the person sitting in front of us because my little 6-year-old shouting boo nonstop at the bad guy. It's a pro wrestling occupies a space for us in storytelling that a lot of other stuff just doesn't. It's sports, it's competition, but it's drama and it's theater. There's fireworks and music, crowd participation. It's just a weird thing that nothing else really captures every aspect of that. So wrestling's really great when it's done well. WWE is an abuse-riddled organization. AEW is better, but not flawless. It could be really cool if we stopped treating people as commodities. I keep trying to wrap it on like a nice note, and I just don't think there is one. But there's wrestling on this week. Lots of it, because it never ends. Okay, that's it. Netflix lied to us with its promotion of this and ultimately tried to promote itself. The myth of one bad apple is just that's what they try to do. This is a problematic industry, and we're going to blame it all on one guy instead of holding anyone accountable or trying to make any change. Also, please give us your money and watch our shows. Ta-da! 59 minutes. I think that's longer than the Harrison Butker video, which is good because I didn't want that to be my longest video. I'm Jeremy. I'm a big fan of wrestling. If you enjoyed this video, if you like pro wrestling, drop down in the comments, let me know that. I'll do more wrestling videos. If you want to see me talk about other stuff, movies, shows, songs about breaking up and heartbreak, I do that stuff too. So like and subscribe. Thanks for hanging out, everybody, wrestling fans. You're the best. If you're local, hit me up. We'll watch pay-per-view together. No, seriously, thanks for sticking around. If you made it this long, we'll be back with something else next week. Take care of yourself. Take care of somebody else. Peace.